All right, thanks for coming out to Philadelphia. A little bit of a bummer that we can't all be in person in Philadelphia, but we'll do the best we can under the circumstances. So at least we can meet virtually. That's great. The session is Introduction to Lando, and I'm going to talk about a lot of things that Lando can do and show you a few of them. And hopefully you'll find it useful and see what's possible in local development environments, and maybe possibly give Lando a try. Okay. I am Geoff St. Pierre. I'm a senior engineer at Tandem, and I work on Drupal and Laravel sites during the day. And I'm an open source evangelist. I love all things open source. I'm a Lando contributor and maintainer, outreach coordinator, which means I get to communicate with developers and folks like you to show them what Lando can do and how we can further the project. I am a Backdrop contributor and maintainer. Backdrop is a fork of Drupal, and we work on that to make that CMS a great user experience for people. And I am the Backdrop Drush extension maintainer, and I have a lot of fun working on that. Contact information, you can reach me on Twitter at Serendipity. My email is jeff@lando.dev. And that's me. Things we're covering today: Lando in general, Lando basics, how to get started, spin up your apps, Lando recipes. So we have these pre-configured recipes that will work with things like Drupal, Backdrop, Laravel, and so forth. And then you can start with a basic recipe, but you can configure it on top of it and make it as complicated as you need to or want to, or you can keep it bearable and simple. In addition to configuring the recipes, you can add in custom tooling to your apps. So you can make existing tools behave in a way that you want them to, or add in different tools that aren't provided by default. So what is Lando? It's a per app, single config file, containerized everything, local dev and DevOps tool. So that's kind of a lot. Let's try to unpack that a little bit and see what that means. So it's a simple in-repo config file, .lando.yaml. This is where you do all of the configuration that has anything to do with Lando. So the configuration of your, kind of the DevOps of your app is just in this single file, not touching the development code of your app. You can use basic pre-configured stacks, the recipes I was talking about. You can add in additional services to any one of your pre-configured apps, for example, Solar. Add in additional tools. You can add in a Node container if you need it or want it. Build and automation steps. So if you have a Composer build, for example, you can have the app run Composer install when you start the app. You can integrate with some hosting partners. And Lando is an abstraction on top of Docker Compose. So anything you can do in Docker Compose, you can do in Lando. You can pass it through to Docker Compose if you need to do some more complicated things. It's cross-platform. You can run this on Windows, Mac, or Linux. It's a local dev dependency manager. And what that means is, so when you add in Solar to your first app, it doesn't add in Solar to all your apps, and it doesn't add Solar on your local machine. So it's completely isolated. So one app could be PHP 5.6 and one could be PHP 7.3, and they don't collide. They're just in their own containers that exist separately from each other. So in that way, it isolates your development stack. So if you're working on 3, 4, 10 apps, it doesn't matter. They're not going to collide with each other. The bones of Lando is Linux. So all the containers that you spin up inside Lando are Linux containers. And it's container based and Docker based. So they're Docker containers. When you do a Lando start, you're going to spin up, you're going to download images from Docker Hub and spin up containers that are going to be your app. And Lando is a wrapper for Docker Compose. So if you're familiar with Docker Compose, you can pass through things from your Lando file just like you would in Docker Compose, and it will pass it off and do the Docker Compose things. So you can make this as simple or as complicated as you need to. If you don't know anything about Docker Compose, that's okay too. You just have to know how to type Lando start. The core languages supported by Lando are .NET, Node, PHP, Python, Ruby, and Go. So they've got some powerful options if you need to switch between different kinds of stacks here. Configurable and swappable services. You can see there's a bunch here. So you can spin up an app with Apache. If you need to switch it to Nginx, you can switch it to Nginx. If you have one app that you're working on that is production as Apache and a different app production as Nginx, you can easily do that without cluttering up your host machine. Both apps can coexist. Lando will isolate those things, and you can use the right things that match your production application and get going. Lots of services available here. Mailhog, Redis, a bunch of them here. These are the pre-baked recipes we were talking about. So when you initialize a Lando app, for example, if you already have like a Drupal 7 app code base, you could just go to that code base and type Lando init, and it will create a .lando.yaml configuration file for you to run that app. It will ask you some questions, and you can choose the Drupal 7 recipe, and it will do the right things. We have other recipes that you can choose: Backdrop, WordPress, all the recipes that you see here. Hosting integrations, platform.sh is on the way. Pantheon exists now. Amazy.io is in edge mode, so you can try that out if you're on the bleeding edge release of Lando. If you don't have Lando, obviously you need to get Lando. You can do that from GitHub. So Lando releases. I think RRC6 is the current go-to release. I think all of that might be an edge release. So, but depending on whether you want stable or edge. The documentation site is docs.lando.dev, and you can see installation instructions there, but basically just double click on the installer and go from there. If you want to install from source because you just want to see it or you want to contribute to Lando, on that same installation page, you can see how to install from source. So if we pop out here for a second, this is the docs page. If you go to, so this is docs.lando.dev, go to getting started, you can see those installation instructions I was talking about and operating specific instructions. And if you want to install from source, down the bottom here from source, we'll get you going with that. All right, .lando.yaml, this is the thing that powers everything that Lando is going to do. This is the way you interact with Lando. And your configuration file can be drop dead simple, just be the name of your application and the recipe that you want to use. And if you need to or want to, you can extend that and add in this config key. And here we're telling it that we want PHP 5.6 and that we want to serve from a web root called web, and then we want a database backend of MariaDB 10.0. So let's pop out here and do a basic demo. So what I've got here is just I'm on a Mac. I'm used to being on Linux, but I had to get a Mac for GoToWebinar. But this is just an empty directory. The only thing that's in here is a Git tree, just because I committed it earlier. But what we're going to do is get going. So if you just type Lando without any additional things, you get a list of things that Lando can do. And what we're interested in right now is this initialization command, so we can start up an app, start up the code for use with Lando. And you can see the other things that are available here: power off, stop, version, things like that. So what we're going to do is Lando init, and we're going to ask us some questions. We're going to say we want to run this from the current working directory, and I'm going to do a lemp app. We have our choices of our recipes here that we were talking about. For this simple example, we're going to do lemp, and we're going to have the web root right in the current directory. You can do a nested web root if you want, like you can do a web folder or a www folder, whatever makes sense for you, whatever you like to do. And let's call this app CMS Philly Lep. Great. So what that does, the Lando init command, is creates the .lando.yaml file for you. So if I refresh my file tree, you see it's created a .lando.yaml. If we go in there, it gives us what we answered to those questions. So the app has a name, it's using a recipe, it's using lemp, and the web root is here. So now I'm going to Lando start this, and that's going to bring up the containers for this app. And what we want to do while that's happening is give it something to serve. So we'll make an index.php file. So we're going to do a very simple PHP app here. Obviously, you can pipe in whatever you need, Symfony or Laravel. Laravel, you can use a recipe. So let's do a PHP file, and let's just do PHP info. And let's save this. And you can see once it's done starting up, we get these URLs. So I'm going to visit this URL, the HTTPS one. And you can see that this is PHP 7.3, and that's the results of my PHP info file. That's great. So we can change that up a little bit. Say we don't want PHP 7.3 under the config in my .lando.yaml file here. I can add a PHP key, and I'm going to say that I want PHP 7.4. I'm going to save that. So before I do anything, you can see that the PHP info spit out 7.3. We can also do that on the command line. So if we just type Lando, now that we have an app going here, we have some more things. It knows it's a PHP app, so it's exposed composer for us, DB export and DB import, so we can interact with our databases, or database if you have singular. And it also exposes this PHP command for a PHP app, so you can run PHP CLI. So nothing different than PHP info, but if we run Lando PHP -v, we can see the version is 7.3. Now we've added PHP 7.4 here, but in order to tell the app about that, we have to rebuild it so it can put together the right containers and pull down a different PHP container and spin up 7.4 instead of 7.3. So let's Lando rebuild this. And that will recreate the containers for this app. And then we should be up with PHP 7.4. And we'll check that out. So Lando PHP -v. And now you see we have 7.4. Just like that, swap out your PHP version, no problem. You can see that through the Lando PHP info as well at the URL. You see that's gone to 7.4. Great. So just like that, you can swap out the different services you need, the different versions of PHP, whatever you need to do to make your app match production. I am going to destroy this app just because I don't need it. I'm going to go on to some different examples. Pop back over to the presentation. So that's a very basic example, lemp stack, PHP, and swap out PHP versions pretty easily. So we can do similar things to a WordPress site, and we can extend what happens in that simple stack. Let's check that out. So what we're going to need is a code base for WordPress, and you can get that from GitHub or an existing repo that you have on your machine, and you can just Lando init it. What you get with these things is the things that we've been talking about: an easily customizable stack, switch out between Apache and Nginx, match your production environment, switch your database backends to match your application in production, whatever you need to use, Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB. Switch your PHP versions, we just saw that. And there's a bunch more services that we saw in that previous slide. For example, Xdebug, custom config files. So if you need to load in a custom php.ini, that's possible. If you need to load in custom Apache config, that's possible. And all those things are documented on our docs page. When you spin up a WordPress application, for example, it's going to give you Composer because it knows it's PHP. It's going to give you WP CLI, and it's going to give you access to a MySQL command prompt. So all those things are detected when you're doing that. So what we're going to do here is a little bit backwards. We're going to initialize an application, and we're going to pass it in WordPress. So you don't necessarily have to pass it in. You could do Lando init just like we just did 2 seconds ago. So I'm going to switch over here. All right, so here's an app I have prepared for WordPress. So right now there's nothing in here except for my Git tree. And I'm going to paste in that command, and that's going to initialize this app for WordPress this time. So just like before, we're going to use current working directory. Where's the web root? This time we're going to use a nested web root, and I'll call the folder web. You can call that whatever you want, obviously. So let's call this app CMS Philly WordPress. And just like before, that creates a config file for us. And it's got a different name. This time we're using the recipe WordPress, and we're using a web root of web. So I'm going to do things a little bit backwards here. I don't have a WordPress code base yet, but I'm going to start this without the code base to spin up the containers. And the reason I'm going to do that is once that spins up, I will have access to PHP command line, and you can see here it's installing WP CLI, so I'll have access to the WordPress command tool, so I can actually get my WordPress code via that. Now when I do that, it's going to take a second to spin up here because it's trying to figure out which services are ready. But since there's no code base in there, it's going to check to see if that container is alive and responding on the web, which it won't be because there's nothing to serve from it. So it's going to have to go through that. It's going to check that 10 or 15 times, and then it'll finally go through. But we'll see some red URLs here because they're not ready, as opposed to the green URLs we saw on the limp stack Lando start. And once that is up, I can use WP CLI because it'll be available to me. I don't have WP CLI installed on my computer. I don't have Node installed on my computer. All those things I'm letting be handled inside the containers so that every app is isolated. So we'll hit WP core download, and we're going to use the path web. So we pop it into that web path that we told Lando that the web root would be web. You can see that in the config file here. So once we get started here, we can pop that in there, and that will download our WordPress code base, and we'll be ready to go with that. So you can see those came up red because there's no code base to serve yet. There's no web directory to go. So Lando WP core download, and we're going to say put it into the directory web. And then we're going to install WordPress, and we're going to use WP CLI to do that, or leverage it. So we're going to create a WP config file, and we're going to pass it in. So these are the credentials you need for a WordPress recipe. Database name is going to be WordPress, user WordPress, pass WordPress, and the host is the database. That's the database container. So if you look under the hood, Docker PS, you see that these are the things that we have. So we have a database container and an app server, and that's what Lando is going to need to connect to this database container. So WordPress knows where the database is serving from. So if I refresh the file tree here, you'll see that downloaded a web directory, and that contains WordPress. That looks familiar to us. And now we're going to create that config file. Oh, I got to go into the WordPress code base. So cd web WP CLI is like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. But now that I'm in the web directory, WP CLI will detect a WordPress and spin up these things for us. Great. So now if we refresh the file tree, you see we got the WP config file, and it's plopped in the things that we care about. So the DB name is WordPress, so on and so forth. Now we can install WordPress. So that's this command. And I'm just going to tell it what the URL of the app is, the title of the app, so on and so forth. Paste that in. So now we should have a working version of WordPress. So the URLs have long gone. So the Lando info command will give you information about your app. It'll tell you the information about the different containers. What we care about this time is the app server, and what I'm after is these URLs, but there's also other useful information in there about your database containers and so on. So I'm gonna click this HTTPS link, and you can see that it's responded to our command. CMS Philly is the app we've installed by the user that I need. So just like that, pretty quickly download a brand new WordPress application, access WP-CLI, and get going with things like that. Great, pretty easy. Let's stop this app and pop back over to our slides. So just like that, you can easily spin up different apps, LEMP stacks, WordPress apps, and we can customize them. So this is just reiterating once we have a WordPress application. So if you just type Lando, you can see what commands are available to you, and those commands will be slightly different based on what kind of an application you're in, whether that's WordPress or a Node app. If it is WordPress, you'll see that the WP command is available to you. If it's a PHP app, you'll see that PHP is available to you. If it's based on a LAMP or LEMP stack, you'll have MySQL available to you, so you can get a MySQL command prompt. You can also connect to that externally through MySQL Pro or something like that if you need to or want to. On the LAMP stack and things that are based on the LAMP stack, you'll have a DB import, DB export, so you can get your data into and out of your Lando apps. And so that's detected on the fly based on what kind of app it is. Lando figures that out. Some other helpful commands that you'll use frequently are Lando start, start your apps, Lando stop, stop your app, restart, restart your app, rebuild, will rebuild it. So for example, when we changed the config file and we changed PHP from 7.3 to 7.4, we went through a rebuild, not a restart, so that it can actually rebuild the containers from the images. And when it sees that 7.4, it gets the PHP 7.4 image and builds a container out of that. And then Lando destroy, we saw that I destroyed the LEMP app I made just to get it out of the way and not be taking up system resources. Lando info, we saw that so we could get our information about our containers, such as URLs or database connection strings, things like that. We did not do Lando SSH, but if you do Lando SSH, it will SSH into the container for you. And by default, that will go into the app server, assuming you're using a recipe. And if you don't want to go into the app server, you can specify -s and say database, for example, and get into the database container. Recommend that you commit your .lando.yaml file, the config file, and push it up in your repo. So you have a single config file that you push up to the repo. And then if another developer comes onto the team, they can just pull down the repo and do Lando start. So git clone, cd into my site, Lando start. It spins up all the configuration, same as all the other developers on the project are using the correct PHP versions and whatever other tooling and services you might have in the app. Everybody gets the same stuff, so you're all working with parity. Now we can customize .lando.yaml file. There's lots of things you can do. You can add in a Node service. So you're running a PHP app, but you add in Node, so you can say compile your SaaS or something like that. You can have build steps. So if you have a Composer-based WordPress or Drupal site, you can have it run Composer install. So the developer number 2 or developer number 3 comes in on the project to get clone it. When they do Lando start, if you have a build step that says Composer install, it will do that. So they not only get the app and the code base from Git, but they get those Composer dependencies as well right on the start. You can add in additional tooling. So if you want to do PHP CS or something like that, you can include that in your project and add a tooling command for that so you can run it. You can pipe in additional services like we talked about Node. I'll show you an example of using Mailhog. I love Mailhog. If you have an app that sends out email, you can have it capture that email so you can see what it's looking like, so you don't accidentally email a couple thousand customers or something like that by mistake, but you still can send the emails so you can see them and figure out what kind of experience they're going to have. Let's pop out for an example here. So for this example, I'll use backdrop. So in this case, I've got a backdrop app already spun up. I've already downloaded the code. Similar to last time, we could have just initialized this and started it and used Drush to download our code base. But we've got that. It's downloaded in a web folder again. And we've told Lando to serve from that folder. So this is our lando.yaml file for this. Let's start this up. And we'll do an example of Mailhog. So we'll see how to use Mailhog. So we get these URLs and click on that. Oh, I broke it. Let's see. Let's rebuild this and see if something went awry here. I was probably on a different branch and something has gone amok, but let's rebuild this app so it's a fresh. Bringing up the containers. So this is where rebuild rebuilds each of those containers. Let's see if it's any happier now. There we go. So that's a pretty backdrop site. So I probably switched branches and didn't stop or kill the app appropriately, but just do a rebuild and it will, in most cases, bring your app up to snuff. So what I want to do here is show an example of Mailhog. So on this WordPress, on this backdrop site, I've added a Geoff user, and I'm going to unblock this user. And then I'm going to block the user to show an example of the mail coming through. So what we want here is user accounts and account emails. So account blocked. We're gonna, so you see I put in a little message here, hello CMS Philly, just so I can see that that's our address. So I'm just adding in a message here. I'm gonna save that. In order to capture the email, I need to add in that Mailhog service. So if we pop over to our docs, so this is getting started, installation. If you go to config, you can see the documentation on all of these different things, the tooling, the recipes we were talking about, the services we're talking about, so you can see the documentation on that. So what we're interested in now is adding a Mailhog service. And the docs will show you how to do that. So we're going to add a services key, and then we're going to name our service. We can name it anything we want. We're going to name ours Mailhog, and then the type, and whether you want to port forward or not, and where you want to hog from. So those are the docs, and I've got a branch over here. So I'm going to check out my Mailhog branch, and I'm going to refresh this file, and I've added in the things for the doc. So I've given a proxy to the Mailhog container to give that a URL. I'm going to copy, and then I've added in the service, Mailhog, type Mailhog 1.0, and port forward false, and I'm going to hog from the app server, and I'm doing SSL true so that that gets a HTTPS URL. When I change that config file, I want to Lando rebuild, so that that service will be popped into the application. So once that rebuilds, we'll have Mailhog, and we can go and block this account. Oop, I'm rebuilding, so I can't go to the app, right? So we'll pop over to that user account, we'll block it, and we'll show that Mailhog will capture that email so that we can view it and see what it looks like. So this is really powerful stuff to be able to drop these things into your applications and utilize these powerful tools without convoluting other apps. They're completely separate, and also not mucking up your computer too much with all this different software that you use for some places and not for other places, so they won't interfere with each other. Take a minute for this to build these new services. And if you have questions about Lando, I'll be around. You can hit me up on Slack. You can join our Lando Slack or hit me up on the CMS Philly Slack, and be glad to help answer questions if you have questions for your Lando travels. Great. So now we say that we have some additional URLs here. These mail URLs, mail.cmsphilly-backdrop. I'm going to click on that, and that brings up the MailHog service. So it gives you this web interface to see, and right now my inbox is 0. So what I'm going to do is proceed to that user, which is active. I'm going to check it off. We've configured that email to send. We're going to block this user, execute that. And then if you pop over here to MailHog, you see now that we do have an email. So instead of that getting sent to the user account or possibly a customer, that's captured here, and you can see that it has the message. So we can see how our message is gonna look, what it's gonna do, and then we can configure that how we want, all in the safety of a local development environment. I really like the MailHog service. I'm glad that that's available to us. So I am going to show another example of a event. So we can use these events, and here's the docs for it, and these are the events that are available to you. And what we're going to do in this case is a PostDB import event. So that's just a way to say, when this thing happens, do this other stuff before it happens or after it happens, however you want. So I have got a branch for that. So I'm going to do git checkout PostDB import. I'm going to refresh this file. And you can see I've added this events key, and that's all in the docs. You can see what you need to do to get this stuff going. And the event that I'm interested in is PostDB import. And after that happens, I'm just going to echo out on the command line, Geoff is the best. So not useful, but just an example of what can happen. So I am going to do a DB export to get the data out, just so I have something to import into the app. So you can see that that has created this database backup file here, which is a gzip file. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to import that using the Lando DB import command. And that's going to fire in that data from that database file into the database container. And then you see that at the end of it, it added in this PostDB import event and echoed out Geoff is the best. So for example, an app I work on, we have Elasticsearch on it, and the Elasticsearch configuration is different on production compared to local. So after we import a database, we have a script that fires off the local configuration and gets us all set up. So that's very nice and convenient to be able to kind of automate these tasks for your local applications. So just making development easier in general is our goal, to make developers' lives easier. Great, let's pop back over to the presentation. So that was Mailhog and DB import, event on PostDB import. And so this is just trying to illustrate you can do a ton of things, pretty much anything you can think of, trying to illustrate some useful examples that I see in my day-to-day life. So if you want to add services, we added a Mailhog service. I've shown you the documentation. These are the URLs. If you want to see how to add in additional tooling steps, you can see that all in documentation. We have some front-end tutorials that you can look at for, like, say, adding in a node service and things like that. We did an example of an event, but if you want to further read, drill down to the documentation, learn more about it, leverage them more powerfully, you can see what's available there. And then build steps, like we talked about, you can run composer install on starting your app. I haven't shown that, but I think we'll see that in the next example. So here's an example of Lando and browser sync. So let's check that out. So I don't know if I stopped this or not. Let's Docker PS. So I got something going. So let me stop this. And excuse me, what I've got here is a Drupal 8 example. In this case, I've already got the code base downloaded. Again, I'm using a web folder, and this is my .lando.yaml file. So you can see this one's a little bit more complicated. So let's start up this app, and let's try to parse through this file and see what's going on. So I'm going to Lando start this. It's got a name, it's got a recipe. We're using Drupal 8 this time. I've got this excludes key. So if you're on a Mac or a Windows, the file sharing between Docker and local is controlled by a little VM that runs the Docker containers for you. On Linux, that's native. So Linux will ignore this key and just run normally. But we're gonna say, let's not file share these back and forth to give us a little bit more speed. So like, I'm not gonna change Drush, I'm not gonna hack Drush, I'm just gonna use the code base. That's gonna be loaded in the container, but not exposed locally to me. So I'm just getting a little extra speed there. You can read about that in the docs if you want. I've got a proxy here, similar to how I did with Mailhog. So you can see in our services, this time we have a node service. So I'm just giving a URL to the node service, b.cmsphilly-bs.lando. Our config key, we've seen that, so we're using Nginx for this app. We got the code, the Drupal code is in the web directory, PHP version, and database backend, we're using MariaDB 10.3. So here's an example of the app server is using this run command. So when we initially start an app or rebuild it, it's going to run this composer install for us so that we get the dependencies that we need. So when we're sharing this between developers, when they do Lando start, it will run composer install for them. We're going to add a node service to this one because we're going to try to use browser sync. And this is going to CD into our theme directory and run yarn so that we get the node dependencies that we need for this particular theme. We'll download our node SAS and things like that we need. The command that's going to run in this container is going to be gulp serve. So it's going to run that out, run that for us, and that's what's going to fire off our browser sync and all of that. So if we look in the Drupal app, web, themes, contrib, bootstrap SAS is the one I've got going. And you can see that there's a gulp file here, and it's including all these node dependencies. That's what the yarn command is doing, grabbing all those for us. And this theme, bootstrap SAS, that I downloaded into my Drupal app, has all this, comes with this gulp file. So it's all configured for us. But what you do have to change is the browser sync configuration. So it's going to use the internal host name for the Docker container app server Nginx. So we get that from our Lando info and pop it in here. I have this in a GitHub repo. Let's see if we can find that. So you can download that and steal it or hack it, do whatever you need to do. This is also in a Lando guide. So if you go to this guides section, you can see front-end tooling, how do I wire up browser sync? And there's a nice guide on how to walk through these files. You can also download the GitHub repo. So GitHub, and it's under Serendipity. Repos, Lando Gump browser sync. So you can grab that and download that if you want to play around with it, and or just like take the gulp file for your configuration of your site. And then in the browser sync init function, we've passed in this proxy URL that we've spun up over here. And you can see there's a comment here, the node proxy domain defined in .lando.yaml file. So that's this proxy URL. And then we're going to use port 80. So from the host computer, we're going to access this via port 80, and it will be forwarded to 3000 in the container. Once you have this configured, you have to worry about that. Once the app starts, it's going to spin up the app server and the node server. The node server is going to run this command in the background, so it'll already be listening. And then it will load that browser sync for us. So that's really nice. So you can just pay attention to your theming, not have to worry about all the stuff that's going on in the background. Once this is set up, you're good to go. So you can have your DevOps engineer set this thing up for you in your .lando.yaml, and then the front-end developers just go to town and do what they're good at. So this is taking a while to start up. I'm not sure my internet is being fussy, but it doesn't usually take this long. I'm gonna kill this and go again. So I'm gonna do Lando rebuild. So I don't like how long that's taking. I think if you guys have questions, you can fire them into the chat. I think a moderator is collecting those for the end. So how are we doing on time? 10:42, this is my last example, so we'll probably have some time for some questions. So this is where it's excluding those directories, so it's loading that code into the container, but it's not going to sync changes between the local to provide a little extra speed. So it knows to get Drush, the Drupal app, so it's grabbing Drush for us. While that's going, I think the only thing left in the presentation is the wrap up. So let's go through that while that app is trying to load. So we have a GitHub issue queue. Lando's open source. So if you go to Lando issues, you can file issues if you notice any bugs or if you want a feature request, things of that nature. Providing your .lando.yaml file is extremely useful to us, and any steps to reproduce. We have a Slack channel, and there's a 1,000+ people there that are answering questions for each other and talking about how they're using Lando. So it's a good place to go. You can access that at launchpass.com/devwithlando. Bunch of resources for you. Lando.dev, kind of the entry point to a lot of things that are going on with Lando. The GitHub repo, obviously, where the releases are stored and you can download the releases. Slack channel we just talked about. You can get support on that Slack channel. I'm in there, the other maintainers are in there, and a lot of people that use Lando every day and are doing fun things with it can help you get going on stuff. Lando's open source, so we have ways to contribute to the project, which help move it forward, which are very useful to us. So if you go to contributing, you see all the different things that. So we can use evangelists if you want to give a presentation like this one, or something else specific to Lando that you're doing, or Lando adjacent that you're using in the app. Maybe it saves you some time. That helps us out a lot. That's great. A lot of people give presentations on different aspects of Lando. Contributor, if you want to contribute code, you can go to contributor over here and go to getting started, and then we'll show you how to get that going from. And there's the guider program where you can write useful guides, like we saw for the Node one and the browser sync. And then if you have a blog post, maybe how a high-level event of how you use Lando to save your company time or money, you want to write a blog post and send it out to a wider audience, you can post that on the lando.dev site. And then there's sponsors. So if you don't have time to contribute to Lando via code or guides, you can become a sponsor of Lando. All right, so now we have this. Do we have time for this example? Okay, so here's our app. What we want to do is open the dev tools, because if you go to settings and in network, you want to disable the browser cache. Otherwise, I had a lot of trouble getting browser sync. Browser sync was connected and it was reloading the page, but it wasn't reloading the changes. So I had something like a 31% success rate. So we'll see what happens here during our live demo. So I'm going to go into the SAS folder, and I'm going to open up style, and I'm going to change the title. So what you can see right now is we have a welcome to CMS Philly pink background. So let's do background color white, and we're going to save that. So the Node service should already be running in the background doing the browser sync things. So you see the page is live reloading here, and then browser sync is going to do its thing. And there you see that it reloaded, browser sync is connected, so all that stuff is fine, but didn't actually load the change. But if I refresh the page, you see the change. Now that kind of defeats the purpose of browser sync, but let's see if we can go back to the pink color. Let's give it some padding. Let's save that. You see it doing the live reload. So all the browser syncs wired up good. So I'm not sure if I have browser cache going on here, or Drupal cache. So that one crashed it. So manual refresh got it going. Let's see. Like I said, I had about a 31% success rate. So let's see how we do here. Browser sync worked fine, but the change didn't actually take effect. So that's sad, but I'm sure once it did kick into work, it did seem to stay pretty consistently, but it's a matter of getting it going. Another thing that you can do is expose the log, so you can see if there's any errors while it's doing your SAS compilation. So I gotta go to CMS code, CMS Philly. So if I do Lando logs, and I want to see the logs of the Node server, and I want to follow them. So this is what's running the browser sync command. So that's the Node container. So if I make a change here, so you can see it fire off the browser sync commands. So that's useful. If there's any error in there, then obviously it's not going to be reflected in your changes. All right, that's what I've got for the demo. I hope you're interested in checking out Lando, possibly contributing, or any interest level you have is fine with us, of course. I'm not sure if we can answer questions in the chat. What time is it? 10:49. So I guess we got a little bit time for questions, but I'm not sure how the questions are delivered to us.